Welcome back, everyone, to yet another exciting session coming up this morning for all of us at Digital Money 2020, organized by Payments Council of India. So, without further ado, I would like to commence with our next session. This session is a panel discussion on the topic exploring the harmony between AI, blockchain, IoT, big data, and other disruptive technologies in payments. And for the same, I would like to welcome our esteemed panelists. We have Mr. Srinivas Nidugondi, EVP and COO, Mahindra Comviva. We welcome you, sir. We have Mr. Vivek Gupta, Country Head, India R3. Welcome you, sir. And we have Mr. Tobias Puehse, Vice President, Innovation and Customer Solutions, Asia Pacific, Mastercard. We welcome you, Tobias. I would first request Tobias to please take over. Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone to this exciting session. We are really pleased to kind of spend a bit of time with you across this panel and discuss the future of technology, future of payments. I will be kicking off today. We decided this is going to be a little bit of a decentralized panel, so we're going to play on each other today to give you an insight into what's in store for the future. So when we think about, obviously, from a Mastercard perspective, let me just maybe give you a little bit of a picture of really the digital payments future and also how do we see, obviously, digital payment evolving, but then also looking into things like blockchain, looking into the new IoT and AI components of that. And first of all, I always say, like, we love all these buzzwords, right? I'm sure we have no presentation these days without actually, Vivek probably always has blockchain in his presentation, like doesn't work any other way. So we have all of these buzzwords, right? But in the end of the day, I think what it comes down to as a community, as an organization, is to figure out what are we trying to solve for? What are the key elements that we're going after? And when I just look at the digital payment space, I think first I always focus on the customer, like who's the end user? And what do they actually have in common, right? And what do they do today? And I think the first realization I think that is really easy to pick up is that this is a digital consumer. This is a mobile first consumer. And so as we think about that consumer landscape and digital payments, how do we take advantage of the device that they are now holding in their hands and ultimately give them all the access to the payment solutions that they want? So let me give you very tangible examples of that. Like, how do we make sure applications and user acquisition is digital in nature, right? eKYC, something that's a big topic in India, always been, and something really where where a lot of financial inclusion has happened over the last few years already, right? Where pretty much people are being included because we made it easy for them to register accounts, bank accounts. Now, the next level really comes to saying, how do we make sure they're not just included, but they're also enabled to transact day to day? Then we need to focus on, for example, how do we make it easier for merchants to accept payments? We have wallets, we have open loop payments, international payments, domestic payments, UPI, Mastercard, all of these rails, and how we actually ultimately come together to make it basically easier for merchants to accept payments electronically, displace cash. I think that's our common enemy, cash displacement. How do we then also think about what's the preferred user experience, right? Actually, both at the merchant point of sale, right? When you think about merchant point of sale, often it gets quite crowded, many different QR codes, many different wallets, many different technologies required. How do we simplify? How do we unify? How do we drive towards common standards and agreements to create opportunity for everyone, be inclusive in that opportunity? Then from a user standpoint too, like how do we make sure that people have the right education, understanding, and capability to get the most convenient payments that's transparent, that's secure, that they can follow through? And then ultimately create maybe more digital linkages. And that's something as an innovation and AI component here to think about how do we create those linkages ultimately and make sure that the user interactivity is not so manual, right? Like when you think about like a lot of the things that the user has to do with between the interactions between themselves and the merchants today are entering a cardholder number or opening an app and scanning something. How do we actually use technology, IoT, blockchain, smart contracts, sensors, etc., to simplify many of these kind of friction points. So first is really the foundation. I think that's what I started off with. And the second point really is like, now that we have the foundation in place, where are the frictions that are still remaining in the ecosystem? And that's when we, for example, look into very quickly fast forward into blockchain activity. What can we do in terms of provenance, in terms of IoT smart contracts, in terms of moving money? And then also obviously cryptocurrency as being kind of a key component. But I know this is a distributed panel, so I don't want to take up all the airtime. So maybe I'll just pass over to Vivek to add some comments, especially I think on when we look at the future of kind of blockchain technology and really thinking about the new collaboration models in the ecosystem that ultimately drive some of these changes that I may have started to outline for you.
Sure. Thanks, Toby. That was an awesome introduction. And to be honest, you brought out the customer perspective pretty clearly. So from my perspective, I think apart from providing an introduction, I want to actually talk about the payments provider perspective and what we can do to make their lives easier or to add value to them. But before that, I mean, Mastercard and Mahindra are very well-known names. R3 may not be so. So I'll just spend 10 seconds to introduce ourselves. So we are a blockchain technology platform company. We started our lives as a consortium of banks who wanted to figure out, how can make their lives easier. This is when, 2015, 2016, when Bitcoin was, 2015, 2016, when Bitcoin was coming to the fore for the first time. Since then, we have evolved as the market has matured into actually becoming a enterprise software company that is now focused on driving blockchain adoption across multiple industries, and payments being one of them. So with that context, I think when we look at payments, and we are a business-to-business company, so companies like Mastercard, like Mahindra are our customers, right? So we put on their hat and try to think or try to bridge the gap between what makes sense for a Mastercard versus what makes sense for the consumer. And one of the key insights I think that we have, and it's been repeated a couple of times as well by other people, is like, nobody goes into an economic transaction with the intention of making payments, right? You don't go to a shop saying, I want to pay, that's why I'm going to a shop. You go to a shop because you want to buy something. Payment is incidental to this entire economic transaction. And what we need to do as we move from, just pure play payments or move from cash to digital payments is to reduce the friction as much as possible. And that's what we focus on. So we focus on two aspects from a payment, one from a consumer perspective and one from a payments provider perspective. From the consumer perspective, we focus on how can we make the payment as seamless as possible. And this is where, things like leveraging blockchain as the data layer along with IoT comes in. So Amazon has done some trial runs on this, but, you could extend it elsewhere. Can I just pick something off from the store and leave without having to stand at the checkout counter, right? From a payment provider perspective, we are taking the view that payments already is a very low margin, competitive business. And with newer and newer technologies coming in and with payments becoming a utility, the margins are always going to be under pressure, right? So what we try to offer to the payment provider is the ability for them to be able to move up the value chain. So can you just move from being a simple, essentially a reconciliation and settlement layer between banks to actually offering complex business flows, right? Can a payments provider not just transfer money cross-border, but can I do, let's say, have a product which is end-to-end university fees payments, for example? Can I offer trade finance natively on my payment rails as opposed to there being a payment leg and then there being a trade finance leg, right? And the promise that blockchain brings in is its ability to actually share data between parties. So what I see is what you see, and we have the same amount of data. and we can then agree on a common set of business principles, and then the ability of smart contracts to actually automate business processes and automate business flows. Right. So for us, when we look at payments, it's all about payments is part of the entire commercial journey. Let's make it as seamless as possible, and let's make it as value added as possible, so that it benefits not just our end consumers, who's the customer, but also our partners like Mastercard and others who are trying to derive value from this business.
So Vivek, just like we both, I think, are in an innovation space, right? Like, from your perspective, like, what actually does it take to convince somebody to make a switch, right? Like, I know we hear a lot of the promise of new technology, right? And my role equally in digital payments. But fundamentally, what do you think actually makes people believers that actually the technology will move the needle?
Well, I think, seeing is believing for one thing. So proof points help. The proof points with big industry players and actual business ROI, being able to show people actual business ROI really helps. But even before that, so the stepping across the chasm is actually one step before that. How do you get them to adopt? And I think at R3, we follow the principle of making adoption as painless as possible for people, right? So there are certain fundamental principles which a lot of blockchain people believe in, which are good and have been there for a reason. But if you have to drive adoption, you have to lower the barriers to adoption. So we do it from a tech perspective, making it easier for people to adopt by using the same tech stack that people have been using for 20, 30 years. We also focus on the business aspects of it, finding network operators whose interest it is in to roll out initiatives like this. So make their life simple and people will adopt. Once they adopt and they start trying, we are pretty confident that there is business value, right? And once there is business value and you have big proof points coming out from leading industry experts, whether it's a Mastercard or whether it's an NPCI in India, then suddenly the virtuous cycle of adoption starts rolling.
Awesome. Now obviously, blockchain is full of data and data explosion. So, Srinivas, if we turn over to you from a mobile application standpoint, from a data explosion standpoint, all the CRM components, how do you see the world in terms of like innovation and automation and all these pieces coming together?
Absolutely. Thank you. But before that, to what you mentioned that we are, am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. So I wanted to kind of say that you mentioned about how we are in a distributed channel where we've taken control of ourselves to have a conversation. About the agile world, if I may. And the parallel I would kind of draw is that agile world is all the tech stuff, people really focusing on innovation. But on the other end of the spectrum, because we talked about financial inclusion, you have the self-help groups which work the same way. They kind of, there's no leader out there. They kind of come together and have been, they really disrupted the industry in terms of how loans are given to the financially excluded. So it's interesting that two ends of the spectrum are following similar principles. And Toby, you just mentioned about mobile again. The same way I would say that two ends of the spectrum have adopted the technology so well. The digital natives, for example, that's the way of doing everything in life, and payments obviously being therefore part of it. Similarly, the whole inclusion paradigm has only got disrupted after the introduction of mobile. And that's the only best piece of technology they ever had in their life, and they've made the fullest use of it, if I may. So that being an interesting paradigm, if you were to look at in the comments, I'm not using the word mobile or digital for a minute, what is it that's kind of required? So we talked saying that, hey, payments need to be swift or fast. They need to be secure. They need to be seamless. And they need to be sound. I'll come to the meaning of sound in a moment. And of course, once you kind of do all that, the personalization. So if you're talking about Swift, the whole concept is how fast can I make the payment? How can I ensure that it kind of not only goes through fast, but it's also successful? So we now hear about QR codes or a contactless instead of me taking out a card, putting in the chip card, for example. So we really kind of are seeing a lot of things happening by which I could make my payment quite fast. If I can go as an on a tangent for a second here, and also I find it a little right, but I'm sure it's going to happen soon. People talk about gesture payment, saying that if you nod your head, you can make the payment. The only problem would be that coming from the part of the country I am, to say yes, probably we would do this. So probably you would need an AI ML engine to you are, and then you accept the payment. But coming back, so there are multiple ways of trying to do a transaction, and how can I ensure that it's kind of really done fast? Then we're talking about secure. And secure is at two ends, isn't it? One, am I the person who's supposed to be, and am I authorized? So at the front end, we're talking about biometrics and a lot of other stuff, by which it could also be end up being convenient, but also can I ensure that the transaction is quite secure? And if we're looking at the backend, and I'm sure including Mastercard and other networks, for example, are really focusing on saying that how do I ensure I detect fraud fast? But more importantly, while we're talking about fraud, there shouldn't be a false negative. What I mean by that is a transaction is actually supposed to be, it has to go through, and you kind of really, or false positive, pardon me, and that actually would kind of kill a transaction and a customer experience. So how do you kind of ensure that you're taking care of those two aspects and ensure that a transaction is not only secure, but also goes through as required? Then we're talking about the seamlessness, or we just talked about frictionlessness. So the aspect regarding Amazon Go was talked about, but I know that in India too, there are a few people who kind of trying to experiment that, saying, can I just pick up the product? It gets billed to me, and we know in a lot of societies, because of the current stay-at-home work from home kind of concepts, a lot of retailers are actually kind of putting fridges and the like, and other vending machines, where using a QR code, I'm able to scan and I'm able to get the products out and complete the transaction in a fairly seamless manner. So that's as important. The soundness, I think that's important for me, is saying, how do I ensure predictively, can I figure out what's happening while it may not be visible to the consumer or a merchant or a business for that matter, but can I figure out, are things going right? Is there a spike somewhere happening? How do I kind of predict all that and ensure that I'm able to then kind of serve the right way for the customers? So for example, every Monday, for example, if the transactions are to be 100 for a merchant payment between say 11 and 12, if there's a spike to 110, can I figure out, hey, is there a business opportunity that I'm missing out? Or if it comes down to 90, is there some merchant whose systems are down? So that predictiveness at a real-time basis is quite important. And finally, I mean, while people believe that it's kind of people are overdoing it, but personalization. Can I get to the n equals 1 and get to meeting the requirements of customers? And that's as important. Now, if you were to look at all these 5 parts I just mentioned, one thing that we've talked about technologies, and we'll come to that in a few minutes again. But if you were to look at it, I believe broadly at the back end, the API first architecture is really determining how do I ensure I make transactions fast, secure, etc. And the aspect about cloud native is also making a difference. So I believe that's the starting point. And while we may say that what's what's the big deal about API? The whole world is, because of the change and in the paradigm moving to the API first thought process, is suddenly kind of people are able to come out with different services in a matter that would never have been possible a few years back. Now, if I were to put against each of these parts, we're talking about IoT, we're talking about big data, especially I believe the AI ML will really come in to make your services sound. And while it may not be visible to customers, as I said, but I think it's really going to make a difference, or even predicting frauds, or ensuring that a wrong transaction, which is otherwise would have been marked as a fraud, actually is kind of approved because it is a genuine transaction. So those aspects, I think, are going to make a difference. And for any service provider, focusing on the platform and these aspects, I think, is clearly how things are moving forward.
Maybe just to build on that, right? I think what we've kind of established is that we have this infrastructure layer, right? This is basically the foundation. And what can that infrastructure layer deliver to us? Then I think really figuring out like what is the application layer, and obviously with new data, with more data coming through, et cetera, that application layer has to become more and more automated ultimately, right? Because consumers are just not going to be able to make all these little micro decisions, as well as back office or other systems have to kind of automate that. And then ultimately still comes I think the ultimate use cases, right, that we're all going after. So I think it's fantastic. And I think when we look at this convergence, really, right, when I look at an example here, actual use case for some of these digital experiences, and I think pieces of that came together. Maybe I'll just take you through one journey of such digital piece. So when I look at we talked about vending machines, etc., but just think about the ability to do ride sharing, right? Or renting a car, for example. So suddenly we have a car that we're renting. Maybe we are paying for that in a mobile application. So here I have a payment gateway transaction. I made a transaction to have a certain vehicle. Now, how does the system know that which vehicle I've paid for? How does the system know that I'm the person that's standing in front of that vehicle? So then it becomes a notification capability, and understanding then through a smart contract, etc., that the car now knows, okay, I received the money and I've now received the instruction to unlock my door for this particular individual. Now, the vehicle has to do an authentication to say, like, I'm not just going to unlock my door for anybody that comes to me right now. I just need to unlock it for the right person. So there comes intelligence around the authentication, back to the fraud element, right? So then once it's unlocking and we start traveling, etc., maybe I cut short my time. It goes back to saying like, okay, you actually only use this car for 53 minutes and 45 seconds. How do I then create microtransaction capabilities to ultimately charge the user for just that amount of time that they use, versus all the waste that we have today in the ecosystem by charging people prepaid amounts for services they're not actually using, right? Charging them for time that is not actually used, charging for, like, I know we know this from telcos, right? Like when we think about airtime, etc., right? We buy certainty or security. Now that's a business model by itself, but I think from a user utility standpoint, I think this is where I think the AI comes together in terms of simplifying things, the IoT component in terms of tracking and censoring all of the elements that come across, the smart contracts to execute all of these value exchanges, so I don't have to worry about all the different little transactions that happen in the background. And I think that is, from my perspective, I think really the value that all of these pieces that we've been talking about, I think, come together.
Absolutely. So if I could maybe come in, Toby, here, the point that you mentioned about use cases, I think is the most important. When you have to customize for specific requirements of different customers, with the capabilities we have in terms of the data, in terms of the information that's kind of passed on. If I were to extend that example of the car, saying today insurance policies, for example, are pretty much standard. Suddenly here is a world of possibility, saying that with the IoT device embedded into the car, the insurance company could clearly figure out what's my pattern? Not just in terms of saying that where do I travel, but how fast do I travel? Do I jump a traffic light? Suddenly, that host of possibilities would kind of come in, and the insurance premiums could be calculated, and suddenly customers would kind of get a lot of advantages, which hitherto would not have been possible.
So hi, this is Sudin here. Thanks, Srinivas. Thanks, Tobias. Thanks, Vivek. So I can share some of the best practices from State Bank of India, where I was head of innovation, as well as some of the advisory roles that I do to global banks. So back in 2018, we did do a blockchain-based transfer remittance from our State Bank of India, Kathmandu branch, Nepal, to our Mumbai branch in the State Bank. Luckily, it was a inward rupee remittance, and there's only Nepal and Bahrain which can do inward rupee remittance. So we didn't have to get into the nitty-gritty of the FEMA and FERA regulations. So that was one use case successfully done. We used the IBM Hyperledger, and we could easily do the transaction. The time it took us, typically 3 to 4 days, was cut down to probably 15 minutes. And also there was a record of that particular transaction, which could be well maintained. So I think the why we are doing this is we run the bank in two ways. The run the bank, which is doing our mission critical systems, all our core banking systems, and change the bank, where we're using technologies like blockchain, like AI, like automation, like big data, like IoT, to completely leverage these technologies so that we can align to today's world, which is contactless, digital, and seamless. So I think the use of blockchain to build the further trust as a service is something that we are looking at further. Especially this comes in wake of the Wirecard fiasco, which really put a bad name to a lot of the digital payment remittances, as well as the entire governance, risk, and compliance. So I think blockchain is better served in that. Yes, it can be also used to have a direct transfer, so as to remove an intermediary. That could be very helpful, so that the remittance can be much faster. On the AI side, I think it is better to use it for creating the opportunities and getting insights and using the data science, because banks, ultimately, we make our money on lending, right? We don't make money on payments or building up that expensive infrastructure. For example, in the bank, in the run, we have our core banking payments, which is connected with a Swift. We also then implemented Yono, which is you only need one, which was our first mobile app, which could be a complete bank in a box service. Very, very successful, and and can be used in parallel with the UPI infrastructure. So now, since we have got this infrastructure, we have to now integrate all these payments into our business products. Very recently, we have also integrated the payments into our lending, our home loans, and we give a discount on the interest rate on the home loans, so that the entire journey of the customer getting a home loan and the payment interface is now much more direct, much more, and in fact much more cheaper. And entire system can be done on the entire loan application, right from the loan origination to the payment, can be effected on the smartphone itself. So I think AI is best used for increasing, looking at more data sourcing, increasing the data coverage, looking at the monetization opportunities, because after having invested a lot of money, I must confess, in the entire digital infrastructure, getting it to work, we also implemented an APS system, a Aadhaar-enabled payment system, where we completely converted a village of 2,000 people and made them bank with the State Bank of India, and that was the AEPS system. So we have all these new change systems, which is completely making us be, more probably in better face, better place than a fintech, and that's really great. Systems like big data, I think, is going to keep increasing. I look at big data more also from a governance perspective, wherein looking at those data sets, looking at any possible fraud. I think it's the amount of fraud that happened in India last year was a whopping 1,86,000 crores. Okay, that's about $25 billion. In my view, and that's my view, all this money recovered could have been actually given to the needy people who require it the most, especially for our financial inclusion programs. So a combination of AI, blockchain, smart contracts is something that is not only going to further enhance the entire monetization opportunities or link up the payments back to our core banking and all our business solutions and products and APIs, but also to further improve our governance, risk, and compliance. Especially, we found that most of the fraud that has happened is payment fraud, and most of that again is 90% of it is lending, is around the loan originating systems and the lending process. So I think the opportunity to leverage technology is absolutely great. It is also good to note that companies like R3 and Mastercard and also Comviva are collaborating with the ecosystem. We worked with the Mahindra team in State Bank. We worked with R3 in alliances or sub alliances. Of course, Mastercard is a very has been the pioneer in the space, especially in terms of sandboxes and also offering APIs. So I great if we combine and further push this digital, contactless, seamless world. I think it'll be a great place where we can further use the entire digital payments journey as a very good monetization opportunity for the entire ecosystem.
Fantastic. And I think we have some questions already coming in from the audience. So I think this one is for Vivek. What fundamental changes in coordination payment ecosystems require to transition to blockchain-based records and retrieval, and then also in regards to the development stage of open banking as well?
Sure. So I think the first question is very interesting, and that's what practitioners like us keep struggling with. So blockchain fundamentally enables coordination and collaboration between parties who cannot otherwise do so, right? And that's one of its biggest strengths, but also in terms of implementation, one of its biggest weaknesses, because you need to reach a common understanding between parties. What we have seen from about 4 or 5 years of implementing this is that the industry has gone through a journey. Originally, when it started, and Sudin was part of some of these initiatives, it was all about forming consortia. Can I get 20 banks to come together and form a consortia? This, while it is probably the purest form to do it, I think had fundamentally certain challenges. I mean, these are people who compete with each other on a day-to-day basis, and suddenly for one specific use case, you come to them and ask them to collaborate, then it becomes a challenge. And consortia, while there are a few very successful consortia now, it has been a long process. It takes 2.5 years. Where we are seeing the industry evolve to now is essentially an increased role for bigger network operators. So someone like Mastercard, for example, or anyone else like an NPCI who runs a big network where the rules are defined and there is already some form of collaboration existing. What we are seeing is people like those coming up as big adopters, right? They are the ones who are bringing their ecosystem on board and encouraging participants to share data. And I think that is a faster way from time to value and time to market, because the foundation has been built up over 10, 15 years. You are just putting in this layer of technology on top to benefit the end user. So that's where I see the system in terms of open banking. Of course, Europe is the leader in open banking. India is getting there. I think we have again chosen a much more federated and decentralized way of implementing open banking. It's a nudge from the regulator rather than a specific guidance or something like that. I think open to the second part of the questions with how can it increase adoption and how can it be successful. I think entrepreneurs who are looking at open banking, and I talk to a lot of them, I think they can drive adoption faster by actually bringing value to the banks. Banks know which part of their business lines are suffering from low profit margins, which part of their business lines are suffering from lower penetration. Attack those problems, work collaboratively with the banks to solve those, and you would find banks willing to embrace you with open arms to drive adoption.
Fantastic. And I think there was also a question on the rural and semi-urban population and kind of the divide of technologies. Maybe this one is for Srinivas, right? In terms of maybe speaking to that.
Could you repeat the question, Toby?
So the question was like, in the next few years, how will these technology impact the digital divide? Will rural and semi-urban populations be benefited in ways currently non-feasible?
Yeah, if at all, I believe these technologies are helping bridge the digital divide rather than widen it, is the view I have. I'd mentioned earlier, if you take across the globe, because of, in the context of India, we're talking about the Jam Trinity, mobile being part of the Jam Trinity and other obviously bringing in the identity aspect. Clearly, people have gotten comfortable with technology across the spectrum. And therefore, as long as service providers are able to target individuals basis their comfort levels, it's definitely going to only get better is the way I would look at it. And I'd mentioned earlier again, right? They're going to be financially literate, where people may be illiterate, but they're going to be financially literate. So can we talk about USSD, for example? So offering USSD, and you go and buy anywhere in India now, including somebody who sells a pot or sells tea on on the roadside, they have a QR code. They understand that. And at the other end of the spectrum, I mentioned about, it could be gesture-based, it could be fingerprint, it could be face recognition, depending on the kind of a phone that you have. Everything is finally driven by an API, and as long as service providers are able to figure out what requires where, it's definitely going to happen is the way I would look at it.
Perfect. So I think we're at the close of our session. Mr. Sudin, would you maybe have a few ending words for us?
No, I think today's world is just a fantastic opportunity for all ecosystem partners to really take this ahead. I think the advent of these technologies is really coming into mainstream in a far faster way. I must confess that it took us a long time, and we are still using at times legacy-based infrastructure as well as platforms as well as core banking engines, but they work perfectly well. But I think on the change side, the success that we've had with all these technologies has really helped us. And we are also able to sync the change with the run. For example, our core banking systems in the state bank, we benchmarked it in 2018 at something like 24,000 transactions per second, or 1.5 billion transactions in a day, which is the most complex advanced core banking system in the world. So I think and this is to serve more than 470 million customers and 650 million accounts, right? Now, when we work in sync with the change, I think this entire new digital age payments, digital age API monetization is going to really help take this entire financial inclusion space of it, whether it's Jam or whether it's Aadhaar or whether it's our lending products. I think everything is going to get integrated, and just as you have integrated risk management, I think we're going to have integrated payment management, where things are going to be automated, things are going to be autonomic, things are going to be completely audited, and I think that's great, really great for the ecosystem. And I'm sure that we can collaborate and make use of this opportunity so that we can serve our billions of customers the way we've been serving over the years without any hitch. As you can see that even in this lockdown, all the banking services were up and ready, and we didn't even have to go to the branch or go to a ATM. We could do all these transactions completely.
Perfect. Sorry, I think we just lost it, but I think that is a great ending point, serving 1 billion consumers. So that's what we're in for. We're all open for collaboration, and we're looking forward to speaking to you all again soon. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists. And thank you, Mr. Baraokar, for joining in despite the technical hurdles. Thank you to the audience for making this session very interactive with all your questions. And we will soon be back with yet another exciting session coming up. Do visit our exhibition space to check out our partner booths and offerings. And please do visit Lyra's booth to participate in the lucky draw and win some exciting prizes. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.